I have to say, it's Shake Hands with the Devil is a far tougher watch. And you really see just the despair that comes over him, and just the war horrors he's seeing, and just it's just traumatizes him. You're kind of seeing a country fall to pieces. What also was brought home to me about the by this film was that the real tragedy of this civil war. The optimistic view to have on the Rwanda genocide is to focus, of course, a film about Rwanda. It's a bleak situation. The focal point has to be on the ones who were saved, the refugees who were saved. Hotel Rwanda is about how Paul Rusesabagina basically managed to turn his hotel into a refugee haven. He managed to protect, I don't know how many, he protected a lot of refugees, a lot of, he saved a lot of lives. He was a real hero, real world hero. General Dallaire has to use his UN compound to be a refugee home, and he's given orders to pull out, and he says, I'm not going to do it. If I pull out, these people are going to die. I'm not doing that. I'm staying. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to run this place properly. But it's overcrowded, and there's a rather grim moment where one of his staff actually falls badly ill.
Fighting there makes delivery nearly impossible. 200,000 people have died in a humanitarian catastrophe. This demands urgent action by the community, the Secretary General said.
This demands urgent action.
President Clinton told the graduating class of the U.S. Naval Academy that
Brent?
We cannot solve every such outburst of civil strife simply by sending in our troops. Remarks taken as a White House reply to demands for military intervention in Rwanda. And according to sources, the Pentagon is reluctant.
It seems to be a form of cerebral malaria. It's going around the refugee camps. You must get him to a good hospital as soon as possible, or we'll lose him.
He'll be on a Canadian herd first thing in the morning.
Like paralytically ill. And it's showing how bad the disease in the refugee camps is getting, to the point where even his staff are catching it.
Hey. Better live it up while you're there. You've got to be back in a week.
Heck yes.
All the refugees were getting sick and dying in the compounds. I had to do something about it.
And that's, of course, the real horror of this ongoing war as well. There are a lot of kids who are in shelter, in some kind of safety in this war, but even if they're not being bombed, they're still in danger. Famine is rampant, disease is rampant. It's all horrible, which of course is one of the main reasons there are calls for ceasefire. There is the hope that a ceasefire will allow more aid to get through. It'll create humanitarian corridors for aid to get in. There's no hope of getting refugees out. It's the strangest thing. There's no way of getting refugees out of Gaza. I'm going to read you something that's frankly disturbing. Egypt has refused to open its doors. They don't want the risk of Hamas coming into their country. Their side of the wall is thicker than Israel's, basically. So the Gazans are not allowed to leave. And there's a bizarre tendency on the left to argue that to allow them to leave is somehow assisting Israel's agenda of ethnically cleansing them. That if you take the refugees out, you are ethnically cleansing them. It's warped and twisted. That's just how vindictive the left are. And I'm going to show you an example of this. One of the most disturbing tweets I've ever read from one of the most deranged anti-Israeli lawyers. Lawyer activists. It's called Stefan Talman. And this should chill you, frankly. Stefan Talman. Evacuation of Palestinian children from Gaza. Is Germany facilitating a war crime? On the 11th of March 2024, Germany facilitated the evacuation of 68 Palestinian children from an orphanage in the Gaza Strip to the occupied West Bank. What looks like a humanitarian operation may in fact constitute a war crime. Protected persons, including children, must not be transferred to places outside the occupied territory, irrespective of the motive. Article 49 GCIV. Article 49 blah blah blah. Fuck the Roman numerals. The occupying power is under a special obligation. Article 49 GCIV. The occupying power is under a special obligation to facilitate the proper working of all institutions devoted to the care of children and to make arrangements for the maintenance of orphans. Article 50 GCIV. Thus, Israel is not making an important humanitarian gesture, but, with the help of Germany, is absolving itself from its obligations under international humanitarian law. Protected persons may be evacuated from an area if the safety of the population or imperative military reasons so demand. If protected persons are evacuated in order to secure their safety, the occupying power has the duty to place the evacuated persons in places of refuge within the occupied territory. Only if material reasons so demand may protected persons be evacuated to places outside the occupied territory. Material reasons means that it must be physically impossible to provide places of refuge within the occupied territory. Evacuated persons must be transferred back to their homes as soon as hostilities in the area in question have ceased. Therefore, as not all children were evacuated from the orphanage in Rafah, it may be questioned whether the evacuation was imperative. If it was not, this would constitute an unlawful transfer. As 2.3 million Palestinian civilians are currently required to find safe areas, that is, places of refuge within the Gaza Strip, and it may be argued that it is not physically impossible to find such places, in that case, the evacuation would amount to an unlawful transfer which constitutes a grave breach of the Geneva Convention and a war crime. If the evacuation is considered lawful because it is at present physically impossible to provide an area of refuge within the Gaza Strip, Germany, having been involved in the evacuation, is under an obligation to ensure that the evacuated persons are transferred back to their homes as soon as hostilities in the Rafah area have ceased. If the children are not allowed to return by Israel, the transfer becomes unlawful, and it may be argued that Germany will be responsible for having aided and assisted the unlawful transfers of protected persons and thus being complicit in a war crime. Right. This is what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with truly sinister, dishonest actors in this. And he's a lawyer. There are activists on the street who are working class, very sentimental, very much caught in the humanitarian crisis of this. But, and easily led to hatred of Israel. Hatred of the West for being complicit in this war horror. To them, dead babies is their red line. Understandably so, and as far as I'm concerned, they're bombarded with the propaganda of how Israel is causing that. And has been causing that for a while. Then, the higher up the hierarchy you get the more powerful, arrogant, frankly twisted, arrogant, kind of power-tripped members of the activist class who are just utterly twisted. and vindictive and, just self-important arrogance. This is insane. Like, this guy is, I don't know if this guy's a narcissist or he sounds like a bloody psychopath. This guy sounds like a psychopath. He's just trying to find any legislation he can penalize Israel on, and indeed, international relation, Israel's diplomatic relations with Germany on. And you can see here, he's, Elon Journo said this, that the danger of making it an obligation that Israel has to provide aid to the enemy is, this is a new kind of expectation, it's a new obligation in war to provide a humanitarian aid to the civilians caught in the crossfire of the war, of any war, including this one. And Israel is obliged to ensure aid gets in. Now, back in the 1940s, when Britain and Germany were at war, and we gained the upper hand in the war, we were doing bombing missions on Germany, and we absolutely devastated Dresden. We devastated German cities. We killed a hell of a lot of civilian collateral. That was fine with us. As far as we were concerned, the mission was to break the enemy's spirit. Hitler was evil. He was a fanatic. He was not going to give up unless we utterly devastated Germany. And we didn't bother with humanitarian aid to Germany. The idea of bombing Germany and delivering aid to Germany would have been deemed absurd. Like, back then, Churchill would have thought that it was absurd that Israel should have to deliver aid to Gaza. Whilst Israel are waging war on Hamas, there were a new generation of Nazis. In fact, by my metric, Gaza and, the Hamas are worse than the Nazis. Hitler was just as vainglorious as Hamas, and that's partly why he got defeated. He got vainglorious about it. Hamas are basically just, they've got that Hitlerite vaingloriousness about them. They are just as evil as Hamas. They're just as evil as Hitler. They're more evil than Hitler, I think. They think that Hitler didn't do enough. They think that Hitler didn't go far enough, frankly. And the thing is, Elon Journo was saying, look, once you start providing aid, once it becomes an obligation, you get this confused morality where if humanitarian aid can get in, basically, if humanitarian aid, if you're not getting enough humanitarian aid, you're vilified for not letting enough in, even though you're doing what Churchill never bothered doing. Back in the day, it would have been considered inconceivable to provide any aid at all to the enemy population. The point was to break their spirit so that the enemy would surrender, ultimately. And no, am I saying that Israel should do it that way? I don't know. I can't get behind the idea of starving Gaza. I can't. I would wish to see, life survive best it can, but Elon Journo was right, that once you do the right thing, it can be weaponized against you. And this is a creepy example of what some of these lawyer activists will do to criminalize, the most noble gesture of all, of trying to protect orphans, try to get them out of danger. And people need to remember this is what we're dealing with here. That the reason why we oppose, the reason to be pro-Israel is because of groups like this, who don't give a shit about the Palestinians. They're just out to hate Israel. They're just out to hurt Israel. They're just deranged. They're just sick people. We have to know what we're dealing with here. These people are a disgrace. And fortunately, in this instance, I found I wasn't the only one. And actually, even some people who were ostensibly on the side of them was being challenged. It's a lot of these marches are resorting to intimidation tactics, and he's resorting to a big intimidation tactics from the backing of the rule book. These are very, very sinister people. He's one of several lawyers I've come across on Twitter who is just behaving like an absolute sinister thug. Yeah. And someone even said, "This is ridiculous. It's like saying someone was breaking and entering for knocking down a door to save a child in a burning house. This really makes Israel critics, especially ones accusing Israel of war crimes, sound like they have bad intentions." But they do. A lot of them do. There are some good people on the pro-Palestine camp. Like, I know people on the pro-Palestine camp who are good people. I have family on the pro-Palestine camp who are good people. It's tragic, really. And so it seems strange that suddenly you got these leftist activists who are actually campaigning to make, or at least lobbying to make, the refugee crisis worse. They're saying, no, we can't allow them to leave because that's ethnic cleansing. They want to stay. Israel should not be allowed to drive them out of their land. And Egypt is doing... I've even seen some arguing that Egypt is doing the right thing by not letting a single refugee out of the country. Saying Egypt is honouring their right to self-determination and the right to remain and not be ethnically cleansed from the Gaza. It is honestly deranged. And I've heard even Cenk Uygur say it. It's crazy. It's sickening, frankly.
The onset of a renewed war between Israel and Hamas has led to fears that millions of Palestinian people living in the Gaza Strip may be forced to become refugees. But despite the fact that Gaza shares a border with Egypt, the Egyptian government almost immediately ruled out any possibility of accepting Palestinian refugees. In fact, Egypt is currently constructing an even larger border wall with Gaza than the one it currently has in place. Now, many outside observers have asked why Egypt, a majority Arab and Islamic nation, would turn away the Palestinian people. And of course, many have pointed out that it may serve the political interests of many Arab nations to refuse to accept Palestinian refugees because it allows them to then blame Israel for any sort of humanitarian crisis that unfolds.
We're dealing with some very, very sinister people. And now, obviously, the situation in Rwanda is the opposite. It's imperative to try and get the refugees out, but it's the difficulty of moving them. And he's saying, look, we're overwhelmed, disease is becoming a problem, we need to move these people out to a safer zone, but we don't have any power to stop the Interahamwe.
We have thousands of people in that stadium. Quite a few of them are Hutus. They're terrified of your troops.
If they're innocent civilians, they have nothing to fear.
There are a lot of Tutsis in the Milkanin who say they'd feel safer if they could get behind your lines.
What are you getting at, General?
I'm proposing we do an exchange. Move people out of these pest holes to places where they'll feel safer and can take care of themselves. We don't have enough food or water or medicine for the people we're trying to protect. People are dying in our compounds. But if we could transfer them to safer locations, we could save a lot of lives. The interim government has agreed to a one-for-one exchange of non-combatants. What about you?
I am fighting a war, General. It's very difficult to say, let's stop for a moment.
The other side has agreed.
They have no momentum to worry about.
We're talking about saving the lives of innocent people.
I am trying to save my country.
And what is that? Those mountains, those trees, that lake over there?
All right. I'll support you in this plan. What about the Interahamwe, General? Have you spoken to their leaders? All three of them? Because I suggest you do that before you start putting unarmed people on trucks.
Now, interestingly enough, the most fascinating thing in it is that in order to try and secure humanitarian transfer, getting the people out, General Dallaire was able to negotiate, bizarrely, a brief ceasefire. with the Interhamwe rebels. With the he even met with the Interhamwe militia leaders, and he was able to negotiate a brief ceasefire. This is kind of like the reason the book is called Shake Hands with the Devil is because in order to secure the ceasefire, he had to do the polite diplomatic thing of shaking the hands of the leaders, even though he just wanted to kill them. He knew that these were utterly evil men.
Wouldn't want to do anything foolish.
Vous avez rien qu'à demander, mon général. On va tout faire pour vous aider.
They're eager to help us in any of our humanitarian projects. They're proud to be working with us. Shook hands with them. I'm sick of it.
Now, I've been against the idea of a ceasefire throughout most of this because I don't trust Hamas will honour it. But I've been probably arguing for a ceasefire from a point of naivety. I don't really know how close Israel are to victory. I keep thinking they must be close to victory and that a ceasefire is just going to set them back. But this has been going on for months now. I don't know how much closer they are to victory. I don't know how much further they are away from victory. They have to win this. I didn't trust, my position was I didn't trust Hamas to honour a ceasefire because they're depraved. They broke the ceasefire on October the 7th. October the 7th was the proof there that no peace could be trusted with them. It removed any doubt that any peace could last, which is the bottom line to me. But I've always had the view that the Interhamwe, Hamas. I got to be honest. I was kind of new to understanding Hamas as a truly evil entity when October the 7th happened. Like I knew they were vile, but in terms of evil, they ranked slightly lower than ISIS. Definitely lower than ISIS. Slightly lower than Al Qaeda. And lower than the Interhamwe. And once October the 7th happened, I realized that they were evil. And that was the difference. I'd always kind of had this view that Israel is ruthless because of the region it's in, because of the hostilities of the region. It has to be ruthless. It can't not be ruthless. Hamas, because it's in opposition with Israel, has to be ruthless as well. There's just no other kind of leadership that the aggrieved Palestinians are going to go with in that kind of mood of hostility. It's a vicious circle. So it's almost like I kind of understood them as ruthless. I understood that they were going to be ruthless. But October the 7th shattered that view. And I realized they're not just ruthless. They're not just pragmatically ruthless. October the 7th showed me that they are just plain evil. I never understood how evil they were, and now I knew. I understood it in a way I never did before. Now, I mean, I'm even open to the possibility that the Hamas of 10 or 20 years ago might not even have been as evil as Hamas eventually became. It's taken them time to become this evil, this warped. I think they've done evil things in the past, but never on a scale like this. But there was still that revisiting Hotel Rwanda and Shake Hands with the Devil. I kind of, it compelled me to think of the Interhamwe as actually more evil even than Hamas, because they just had it was just a blood frenzy when they started killing Tutsis, and they were doing it constantly. I mean, I remember the first time I watched Hotel Rwanda, it was, we'd had the Iraq War, and I was listening to a lot of, I was being dragged to quite a few Stop the War meetings, and I think we all got a bit high on, and it's similar with Doctor Who fandom, we all got a bit high on this idea that pacifism could work. Not going to war could work. Everyone could be reasonable somehow. When your worldview is that Bush and Blair are the most evil force in the world, then you tend to think, well, the rest of the world must be not that bad. Must be open to reason, I guess. If we just educate them the right way, which, of course, Blair was trying to do in Afghanistan. He was trying to kind of, create a more enlightened culture out of Afghanistan. To kind of move them past the medievalism of the Taliban. Disastrous idea, failed miserably, as we all know. And Hotel Rwanda, but the thing is, I had this naive pacifist view, and it was this whole. We kind of descended into a bit of a cult of sentimental empathy at that point. It was a kind of the post Diana era, where you suddenly had this cult of sentimentality just overtook the country, and it was there in Doctor Who as well. It was there in a lot of TV shows. It was encouraged, that if we just opened our hearts to each other, we'd recognise the heart in each other. Hotel Rwanda was, for me, the big shock to that worldview. It kind of revealed how cultish that worldview was, because if there was any part of me that was still clinging on to that naive leftist hope, but that naive 2005, sentimental liberal hope that everyone is capable of empathy eventually. It just takes time to come out. You've got to work with people for it to come out. Watching the massacres committed by the Interhamwe, it was kind of like, okay, they're not capable. They're not showing empathy. But at some point they've got to start caring. At some point they've got to start getting sick of the killing. But instead, they developed a twisted, perverse bloodlust for it. They developed a taste for it, a hunger for it, and they went into a frenzy of killing, and they just weren't stopping. They had no mercy. I was kind of realizing that evil exists. Some people are just evil. Some people just have no empathy. They'll never have empathy. It doesn't matter how many people they kill. They're never going to regret it.
Soon, all the Tutsis will be dead.
You do not honestly believe that you can kill them all.
And why not? Why not? We are halfway there already.
Because they're just that full of hate. I mean, I suppose it kind of is a testament to how naive my thinking was at the time. I was absorbing a lot of the naivety of the left. I mean, to be honest, when I look back on that period, I feel like autism. My autism was playing into that. It's like when I was with the, Iraq war marches. When I was on the march, because my mum was on the march, my family were on the march. It made sense to go on the march, and I didn't think that bombing Iraq was the right thing to do. Really, it didn't seem to make sense in the context of the war on terror, but I didn't feel any kind of strong convictions about it. I certainly didn't think that I certainly didn't think that Tony Blair was worse than Saddam Hussein. But I think in that environment, I developed a certain. It's like I couldn't quite go along with the cultish thinking on there, the kind of the zeitgeist of thought on there, which was just basically a typical leftist, anti-imperialist masochism, just and I think I tried to go along with it. I feel like in a way it was almost like an element of imposter syndrome was playing into it. Kind of, I want to do what the compassionate thing to do is. I want to think what the compassionate thing to think is. And that is, of course, no killing, no war. War is bad. Killing is bad. Empathy is good. There were kind of thoughts at the back of my head of, well, there was a little part of me that wondered if, but I just wouldn't let myself entertain the thought, if you know what I mean, that, because I didn't have an answer to it, which is, well, would it not be the greatest sin to pass up this chance to remove a dictator butcher like Saddam from power? If you get him out of power, then yeah, we'll kill people. Yeah, it will kill people in the process. It'll kill innocent civilians in the process, but it will also remove an evil dictator, prevent his evil reign of terror. Would it be a crime to just leave him in power when we could remove him? And I didn't quite understand the cultish thinking. I thought of these people as they're my intellectual elders. They're more well-read than me. I'm still new to all this. I'm sure if I read it all, I'll be able to go along with their worldview. So Hotel Rwanda kind of, just it shook me out of that cultish mindset of trying to be what the anti-war movement, are naturally in their kind of, in their very tribal sense of where their empathy goes out, and as we saw in this whole debacle, where their empathy shuts off, where they have no empathy. And when it comes to Israel, they have no empathy. When it comes to the, Bush and Blair, they have no empathy. No empathy, really. So I came away realizing that was kind of my real first exposure to the evil of the Interhamwe. And so it absolutely astounded me to think that it was possible to negotiate a ceasefire with them. That just amazed me. That it was even thought as possible. I mean, to put it perhaps, a bit tastelessly, they're engaged in a genocide. Has anyone ever thought that calling for a cease genocide works? Yeah, put bluntly, look, these people are killing people without mercy. They're killing unarmed people. They're hacking people to death. There's no two sides to this. There's no, well, if you start hacking them to death, they'll stop dying at your feet, I suppose. They'll stop getting their blood on your bloody Interhamwe Megalia. What a great injustice you'll be spared that injustice, you evil genocidal bastards. I think the truth about ceasefires is they actually happen quite often in combat zones. Because combat zones, conflict zones, civil war conflict zones are they're hell. They're hell, and it becomes very, very hard for what's left of society to function in them. And to a degree, you need some part of the society to function if you're fighting for your turf. If you're fighting for your turf, sometimes you need aid to come in to help your people. You need weapon shipments. Your army gets exhausted. They need to basically rest from the combat. They can't maintain the combat perpetually. You have to be an exceptional kind of army to do that. And so, you need things to keep this war going. Your enemy needs things to keep their side of it going. And both of you have your terms and demands, that you want appeased in order for the ceasefire to be facilitated. And once the ceasefire is declared, it's no longer such a dangerous terrain for aid to get through, goods to get through, ammunition to get through, or transfer of people to get through. Safe passage. Allow safe passage for the people you do care about. And so the idea is that as long as each party has a self-interest that they want met, they'll honour the ceasefire to get what they want from the other side. It's like, okay, we're giving them what they want, but they're giving us what we want, as long as we honour the ceasefire. And as long as we honour the ceasefire, the whole, honouring the ceasefire is a guarantor that if we need a ceasefire again for the same kind of thing, then it can happen again. The other party might trust us to honour it again. Whereas if we break the ceasefire now, we're probably not going to get another ceasefire. And if we don't get another ceasefire, we're not going to get what we need. We'll probably, it's going to be much harder to get, another one. And ceasefires are about basically pandering to self-interest. And Hamas has its self-interest. Israel has its self-interest. It wants the hostages. And the idea is that, well, a ceasefire allows an exchange of hostages, an exchange of prisoners, and it allows humanitarian aid to pass through in the meantime, which is what the world wants. Israel wants its hostages. Hamas wants its political prisoners back. Mostly people in the West Bank who've been arrested for stabbing Jews, or trying to stab Jews at least. And the whole thing is, well, we got to appease them for them to appease us. And of course, the West wants, they're putting international pressure on Israel, and they want to be appeased with a humanitarian brief ceasefire, humanitarian pause, if you know what I mean, to get the aid in, because the aid needs to come in. And it was kind of the same with the Interhamwe. I believe they wanted some of their prisoners back. Some prisoners had been held captive by the RPF. They wanted some of their prisoners back. I think they had other demands of the actual Rwandan army as well that they wanted met. And of course, the deal was that if they kept the ceasefire, then it would allow the passage of refugees from Rwanda to the RPF territory, or just outside Rwanda. It allowed them a safe passage to leave the country unharmed. And the Interhamwe, bizarrely, seemed willing to honour that. Although, maybe not.
Everyone just stand back! Don't panic! Close the gate! This is Mama Papa 1.
Come in, Mama Papa. Where are you? Over.
Foxtrot, we have a problem. The militia are not letting us through. I thought we had a deal with the intercomway.
Roger out. Menteurs. Vous êtes juste une hostie de gang de menteurs! Vous m'aviez promis!
Il y a eu un malentendu.
Moi, je suis prêt à travailler avec tous les leaders de ce pays. Vous y compris. Condition que vous en fassiez partie.
I should have shot them. How many lives would I have saved if I'd done that?
How many lives would it have cost? Don't put this on your list of failures, General. Those transfers saved a lot of people.
Not enough. Never enough.
You can't always trust people in a ceasefire. Now, I must admit, this kind of forced me to question some of my own naivety again, because I was just of the view that there's no ceasefire to honour with Hamas. There's no point to a ceasefire. The ceasefire will just be broken by them anyway. And I also thought, it's giving Hamas an escape corridor when they could be very close to defeat, possibly. Whereas, and the way I saw it was the difference in Rwanda is that no one was winning. And a brief humanitarian ceasefire to get people out to safety from that hellish country that was it was lost, basically. It was like a ceasefire to get your people out is as good as it gets. That's the best out. That's as good as it gets. No one's going to win. The UN are not allowed to win. The Interhamwe are on the winning side, but they still want certain demands met. And so it did make me rethink maybe ceasefires, maybe they can work, but I didn't trust the kind of people who were calling for a ceasefire, because the kind of people who were calling for a ceasefire did seem to, so much of the anti-war left had betrayed any trust, as far as I could see, that they even cared about, Hamas's defeat. They seem to want Hamas to win, a lot of them. An awful lot of them seem to want Hamas to win. It's the most disturbing thing I've ever seen in my life. And I'll never forget it. I think a lot of people will never forget it. Now, well, it showed, I think that's the point, really. That scene was him really being disgusted at the fact he had to be polite and almost obsequious with these evil men. And he didn't do it, with any joy or relish. He was, it sickened him to do. And he did say after, I should have killed them. They were evil men. I should have taken that chance to kill them. It's poignant because I think it too. I think, he was I understand. I think that's always been my main, the difference for me is he was disgusted to shake their hand. I have no faith that the left would be disgusted to shake the hand of Hamas. I think they would embrace them as brothers in arms, frankly. It's frankly disturbing. But the UN were powerless, so they were at the disposal of the Interhamwe, who could, call the shots. And frankly, it surprised me that they would even agree to anything. The ball was seemed complete in the court. And toward the end of the film, he starts to lose his composure, and he actually says there came a point where he could, he obviously aged death affected him deeply, but he could be hard-headed about it. He did make the effort to just, where he could honor the dead. There's a particular scene where he's driving through, a mound of bodies, and Well, he's driving. Him and his UN troops are driving toward a road, and it's filled with bodies. And there's a kind of poignant moment where they're trying their best to navigate their way around the bodies because they don't want to desecrate the dead. It's like and so he's trying to get them to the side, get them to, well, they're not going to get trampled over.
Bring the cars. Take this boy. Yes.
So he does see a lot of horrors, and he says, this caused him flashbacks, real post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, real PTSD for years. But he said there was a particular moment where he'd walked over a bridge, over a little kind of makeshift rackety bridge, walkway bridge, over this river stream, and he notices this someone's cloth, and he removes the boards and he realizes that the cloth belongs to one of the many bodies that have been dumped in that stream and hidden from view, and he just sees these corpses. And he says for some reason that was the point where he could be resilient no more, and it started to break him. And he says like the film in some ways it's about the worst thing of what happens when men in that line of duty come to a point where they can't do anything, they're hopeless to do anything, and they're seeing all this suffering, and quite often they are just hoping to die next, just so it's over. They just think, what's the point? Might as well just walk into the line of fire. At least if I do that, it's over. It's done then. And the film was about his long journey to come back from that. The ending of the film is one that gives a note of hope and of some hope, but some despair as well. Hope and despair. I'll cover the hope first. I'll cover the despair first, actually. No, I'll cover the despair first. That's what I'll cover first. The despair. My resolve against Hamas is kind of confirmed by this movie, by what we see in the absolute devastation caused to Rwanda. And that there's almost nothing left to preserve. There's just so much death, and there's so much as country's gone, it seems. It seems like there's no way back for Rwanda at all. There's a particular quote by Sun Tzu. An evil enemy will burn his own nation to the ground to rule over the ashes. And that's what they were dealing with in Rwanda. And into Ham, we were willing to just destroy the whole country in this. That's what Hitler was prepared to. And it's what ISIS were prepared to do as well. More disturbingly, it's what Hamas are prepared to do. I've always said that the horror of what we're seeing in Gaza is Hamas, is testament to it's happening because Hamas refused to surrender. They refused to acknowledge that they went too far on October the 7th. The whole point was to go too far. The whole point was to provoke a massive overreaction that would lead to this war. They wanted this war because Iran told them to start this war. Because Iran wanted to sabotage the normalization that was being achieved between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Point was to destroy peace.
Make no mistake about this. They are not concerned with collateral damage inside Gaza, or inside, indeed, any Palestinian-controlled territories. They do not possess the same perspective on loss of life and a differentiation between civilians and between uniformed combatants as people in the post-Enlightenment West do, and I need you to understand that.
Hamas are the most evil enemy. They are truly an enemy that will burn their nation down to the ground to rule over the ashes. And the horror of what we're seeing happen in Gaza is because of Hamas's resilience. In military, you've got to be ruthless, you've got to be resilient, you've got to be prepared to make the tough decisions and stick a war out. And say, look, I couldn't do it. This war has made me realize I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it without getting, despite everything, I am a bleeding heart. And this, of course, causes a disconnect from the left, who cannot imagine someone thinking that way without being a callous psychopath. But that's what you've got to be in order to win a war. Especially a war that you've got no choice but to fight, because your enemy is never going to make peace with you. Your enemy is determined to make peace impossible. Your enemy is determined to kill your people, and you have a duty to defend your people. Israel didn't choose this war, it was forced on them by Hamas. Hamas could have ended this war at any time of their choosing. And they've chosen to keep the war going and keep the suffering going in the hope they will defeat a greater military power like Israel. It's like whether they have any hope of succeeding or failing in that, they are prepared. All the deaths we've seen so far in this war are, as much as they are what is galvanizing the anti-Israel crowd to protest all the more. For me, those deaths are testament to how far Hamas are prepared to go, how many of their own people they are prepared to keep putting to the slaughter in this stupid, vainglorious war. People ask, and this is the problem. A lot of these pro-Palestine activists are asking, is this enough? When is this going to be enough? The disturbing answer to that is when will Hamas think it's enough? Hamas are showing, it's certainly not enough for Hamas. Hamas are determined to keep this going to the bitter end. They're prepared to keep the death toll rising, as if it's not bad enough as it is, as if it's not horrific enough as it is, as if enough children haven't died as it is. And you can blame Israel for that, but it takes two to tango, and as far as I'm concerned, Hamas is taking the lead. They could disengage at any point. Israel can't. Israel can't disengage. It cannot let Hamas survive. And, that's how far Hamas are prepared to go. That's how many they're prepared to sacrifice. And that scares the hell out of me. That scares the hell out of me. And it should scare the hell out of you. If it doesn't scare the hell out of you, I don't think you're paying attention, really. I don't think you've been paying attention. And because it scares the hell out of me, I know that Israel cannot allow Hamas to continue to exist. No country can continue to be ruled by an insane death cult like that. Irredeemable death cult, unreachable death cult. That's beyond reason. They can maybe meet their self-interest to a point, but they're beyond reason.
I should have shot them. How many lives would I have saved if I'd done that?
And it was kind of the same with the Interhamwe. They were prepared to destroy their country, to rule over the ashes, as it were. Whatever else you might say about, the Israelis or the Palestinians and the Nakba, at least Israel was fighting for some kind of a nation. At least there was a sense of a nation they were fighting for, a people they were fighting for, a homeland they were fighting for, a safe refuge they were fighting for their people. The Interhamwe just wanted to burn it all down. The war logic, it was just followed a logic of just blood frenzy, kill frenzy. There was no logic to it anymore. It was just rampant, raging hate and intolerance. It was just fanaticism, and Hamas are an even worse example. And that scene, I should have shot them. All the lives I could have saved. Sums it up for me. For all the talk of crimes against humanity in this war, for me, the greatest crime against humanity, for me, if Israel had decided to let October the 7th go and allow Hamas to live, to me, there would have been no greater crime against humanity than that. There would be no greater crime against humanity than to allow Hamas to live after what they did on October the 7th. To let Hamas live, to let Hamas continue to live, continue to exist after October the 7th, to me, there is no greater crime against humanity there would have been no greater crime against humanity than that. And I champion Israel all the way in making sure that they don't survive. Because if they survive, that would be a crime against humanity. Hamas have to be crushed. An enemy like this is just satanic. It's just evil. Cannot continue to exist on this world. I won't have it. Israel shouldn't have it. No one should have it. Those people who think it can be coexisted with are in utter denial. So that's my position. That's why I am pro-Israel all the way. I am praying that Israel win this war. In fact, let me show you. Yeah. Zippy Hotovelli said recently, "My deepest condolences go to the families and friends of John Chapman, James Henderson and James Kirby, the 3 British nationals unintentionally killed in Gaza while on a World Central Kitchen aid mission. This was a tragic mistake that followed misidentification and should not have happened. All 3 men and their colleagues were carrying out incredibly important work helping others in a challenging environment. Israel values the great contribution they made and that of all aid workers in providing crucial assistance to Israelis and Palestinians at this difficult time." And I felt the need to say in reply this. I accept your apology. Hamas are the ones really to blame for this and for this whole war. I'm praying for you to win this against those evil terrorist hellspawn. There can be no world with Hamas anymore. I meant every word of it. It doesn't dent my support for Israel that those aid workers were killed. It doesn't dent my support for Israel, even if the IDF are not the most moral army in the world. They don't have to be. They just have to be more moral than Hamas, because there's no such thing as the most moral army in the world. There isn't. That's just not how the military works. But there is a least moral army in the world. I don't think there's any such thing as a most moral army in the world, but I now do believe there is such a thing as a least moral army in the world. As the most evil army in the world, and that is Hamas. Hamas is an abomination. And if international law forbids Israel from winning this, just like the stupid laws of the UN prevented General Dallaire from putting a stop to the genocide, then I say is international law allowed an evil abomination like Hamas to exist for 18 years. A loophole allowed it to exist, and the will of Arab states, certain Arab states with an agenda to undermine Israel, allowed an abomination like Hamas to exist in power for 18 years. And breed new generations of psychopaths. Warped psychopaths.
قوم مدورين على الولاد الصغار طوق طوق خيو طوق روح طخوهم انتوا ضارين على هالشغلات هذه ضارين على الولاد الصغار طخوهم تقتلوهم هيو طخه جيب لك ثانيين الا شو كاشر البيتخون غلط بس استنى كليب هالدنيا بنشوف شو بتسوي استنى كليب.
If international law allowed that to exist, if the Geneva Convention allows a creep like that lawyer to prosecute Israel for transferring a few orphans out of a danger zone, then international law is a disgrace and it needs to be ripped up. To hell with international law. It's an impediment to justice. We need to get rid of it. We need to leave the UN. As far as I'm concerned, the UN should be dismantled. Everything that impedes Israel's right to exist and right to defend itself needs to be dismantled. Maybe when that's done, then we can talk about ending martial law in the West Bank. Maybe. When things improve. So that's my resolve. It's the war horrors, they get to me, but they also, at the end of the day, it reinforces my resolve. That an enemy like this, that determined to sacrifice so many of their own people, needs to be crushed. Gaza needs to lose Hamas. Hamas needs to be gone from Gaza. They need to be destroyed. So what was the note of hope? Was there any?
Everybody wants to forget Rwanda now. Can't let that happen. I haven't finished my mission.
You have to keep me alive. It's an order.
La
According to the end credits of Shake Hands with the Devil, depending on which version you get, there was apparently a project, a national project, possibly international, in fact, to work on rebuilding Rwanda and getting all the people who'd fled the war to come home. To rebuild the country, essentially. As a project for reconciliation and forgiveness. Now, I struggle to imagine how forgiveness could be possible after the horrors there. How reconciliation could be possible. But apparently, with enough will behind it, with enough international support behind it, it did. Decades after, 10 to 20 years after, it did succeed. It did become a success story. An unexpected success story. In fact, let's find the article on it. Why Rwanda is held up as a model for reconciliation 20 years after genocide. Reconciliation has enabled Rwandans to close a chapter of their history and write a new one, says Professor. The killing began on a Thursday. It was April 7th, 1994. The scenes that eventually made their way onto our televisions and newspapers alternated between long, silent columns of people carrying whatever they could possibly carry hoisted on their heads and backs, and crowds of people sitting listlessly, frightened in makeshift camps, hoping someone, anyone, could tell them what was happening. The accounts from those 100 days were jarring in the intimacy of the brutality. Neighbour turning against neighbour. Family members killing their own. School teachers outing their own students. The killing went on at an industrial pace, and at the end, up to 800,000 Tutsis were dead, along with tens of thousands of Hutu. 2.5 decades later, Rwanda still manages to hold on to the peace it forged for itself. Confession as a way forward. The post-genocide RPF government imposed a reckoning from the top, but it was also up to ordinary Rwandans to figure out how to carry on day to day. The Gazaca court system made use of a traditional dispute resolution forum to bring perpetrators face to face with victims and the broader community to confess and ask for forgiveness. Punishment ranged from prison time to community service, but importantly, it gave victims an opportunity to publicly speak their truth. Regina King was a university student who was home for the holidays when the genocide began. She's now an associate professor of social work at the University of Calgary. She initially sheltered with family and friends, escaping into the bush when men with machetes came around. Her group started out with 74 members. By the end, there were only 14 people left. It took me a while to understand the whole notion of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because even according to the Gazaca, it was something for me out of place, because I believed Gazaca, as I knew it, was a place you go to hear both sides. Then someone facilitates that restorative justice where people can admit the truth as it happened, and then they go back to normal. But there was nothing normal about the genocide. There was nothing normal about the genocide, and there was nothing normal of going back. There wasn't anything to go back to. It took me a while to understand that the country is just searching for ways to move forward, and that shaped what you would call the official narrative. That if we're going to live in the same neighbourhoods and have some taste of what it means to come back together, it had to happen in certain ways. It wasn't going to restore what was lost. It wasn't going to go back to what things used to be before. It was to devise ways forward. Living with many truths. The Gassica system was not meant to be a fact-finding project as such. Local tribes were about one thing: confessions of Hutu perpetrators who attacked Tutsi people. Gassica trials were not here to hear about Hutu to Hutu violence or government violence towards citizens. Anu Chakravarti teaches political science at the University of South Carolina. She studied the Gassica system up close as they happened and says the confessions were motivated often by guilty conscience but also by desire on the part of the perpetrator to make amends and start life over. She points out that the facts of the genocide are well established. There is ample evidence and it is uncontested. But in the lives of individual Rwandans, there is also a personal experience of the genocide that also figures into reconciliation. So you can imagine thousands and thousands of individual Hutus stepping up and talking about their own personal truths. I mean, that was some kind of reckoning. And so there's that level of truth where people understand that what they did to their friends and neighbours was absolutely wrong, that they were misled by their own leaders, and that when push came to shove, their leaders escaped. And so Rwandans live with many truths, fragments of many truths at this point in their everyday lives. The truth that I think, they abide by, and the truth that they rely on, is that what they did was criminal. And I think there is an acceptance of that. There's an understanding of that and a willingness to make amends to the extent possible as they move on. No people have a single memory. The question of truth is taken up in various ways in Rwanda. There is, of course, the factual truth, the demonstrable truth, but there are the truths Rwandans tell themselves and each other that make up the collective memory of the genocide. Isai Nezimana is a professor of philosophy at the University of Rwanda. He notes that reconciling after a genocide may seem like an impossible task, but it requires one to ask about what a possible future could look like. I would say there's no difference between truths and facts, but rather there's a relation of correspondence between them. Facts are the objective face of truth, and likewise truth are the subjective face of facts. Our country started from this premise. What if reconciliation between Rwandans was possible? Rwandans, then acting from the assumption that the reconciliation was indeed possible, shifted the dynamic. Rwandan reconciliation is a model to follow because it has enabled Rwandans to understand and close one chapter of their history and begin a new one. There is no one memory. There are memories. There is no one commemoration. There are commemorations. No people have a single memory, and it is dangerous to reduce people to a single memory. Think of building vertically instead of horizontally. This is dangerous because if one memory fails, your society, your people have no other resources to rely on. Sometimes I think it's something of a trap to always bring people back to their past and always letting the present and the future escape them. However, it's true. The past is a chapter we must recognize, but the present and the future are two other chapters. Now, the takeaway from that is, it seems complicated. The question, of course, is if something as astounding as a reconciliation and forgiveness could be possible after the horrors of Rwanda, then it seems surely, by 2019, which is, the genocide was 1994, 2019, that's 25 years on. 25 years on, it was possible. And that is astounding to me. It's astounding. But if it was possible, then surely it should have been possible after the Nakba for some kind of peace and reconciliation. That 25 years on, maybe 25 years is the date to do it. The Nakba happened in 1948. The time to do it would be, that's Well, let's just say 1958, start in 1958 or 1968. It seems like it would have been easier to, on the face of it, seems it should have been easier, but we can't know. The partition happened because the two sides couldn't coexist, so I don't know if they would ever want to coexist. And Israel already had its country. There wasn't really the imperative to build a new shared country with them. Like I said, Israel was very much Fortress Israel. It was, a survival culture. It was, very much so the Palestinians had no one really to reconcile with. They didn't really have a state. They'd lost their state. And so the bitterness carried on, unfortunately. And there were various kind of regional agendas against having it reconciled. Surrounding Arab states hated Israel, and so they had an agenda to keep the grievance going. Israel possibly is to blame for the fact there's been no reconciliation, but we can't know if it would work. Sometimes reconciliation is possible, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes there's a reason partitions happen. India and Pakistan still hate each other to this day. Well, India and Pakistan have continued to hate each other long after their partition in 1948. Which was actually far bloodier partition than the Israel-Palestine. It was far bloodier than the Nakba, apparently. It was far bloodier than the Nakba. The Arab states were against the idea of repatriating the Palestinian refugees, and so were the UN. They wanted to kind of mold and groom quite a lot of the surrounding states wanted to mold and groom a terrorist guerrilla proxy with agreements against Israel to fight proxy warfare against Israel, because to them it was an affront to have a Jewish state in the Middle East. So there was an agenda to keep the grievance going. And, there were many bloody years of conflict, and for a time it looked like a peace process might be possible, a two-state solution. And now it looks like it might be dead.
And Hamas is really smart. When they decide to rocket Israel, they insinuate themselves in the hospitals, in the schools, in the highly populous areas, and they are smart. So they try. They try to put the Israelis in a position of either not defending themselves or killing innocents. They're good at it. They're smart. They've been doing this a long time. Look, I don't agree. I killed myself to give the Palestinians a state. I had a deal they turned down that would have given them all of Gaza, all of Gaza, between 96 and 97% of the West Bank, compensating land in Israel, you name it. Then, when Mr. Fayyad was the prime minister of the Palestinians on the West Bank, we had all the Muslim countries willing to normalize relations with Israel if they had recognized the Palestinian state. Did I agree with the Israeli policy? No. My whole life I did that. Hillary got the only 3 face-to-face meetings between Mr. Netanyahu and the leader of the Palestinians, President Abbas, that anybody's gotten in the last 8 years.
Besides, this was about the idea of neighbours reconciling, and the view of the Palestinians was always going to be that the Jews were always an outside intrusion. I think maybe they'll just never let go of that view, and they'll never recognise the Jews as their neighbours. They're forced to recognise the Jews as their neighbours because the Jews, Israel's going nowhere. That's just how it is. And so Is it hopeless? And how much should Israel be blamed for that? And how much should the other states be blamed for that? After all, it was Israel's Nakba. It does seem to be on them to make amends, or at least it was, but we're past the point of making amends now. What Hamas has done is it's just made it further impossible to come back from. Any forgiveness that might have been possible before is gone. Unfortunately, in the story of the Israel-Palestine conflict, forgiveness was very, very difficult to find. Not enough, never enough to form a critical mass that could change the direction of this war. But I'm going to read you an article. I'm going to read you a tweet that actually demonstrates the brief rose that grew from the concrete of this. And it grew from very, very unpleasant conditions, desperate conditions, in fact. It's a tweet by a long tweet essay by Captain Allen. He says, I can prove to you in one word that the alleged pro-Palestinian protests worldwide are, at best, anti-Israel based on ignorance. At worst, wildly anti-Semitic and or hatefully anti-Israel, and the one thing they are not is pro-Palestinian. That word, Yarmouk. Yarmouk was, only 12 years ago, the Syrian city with the world's largest Palestinian community. At least 160,000 Palestinians lived there. But once Syrian dictator and butcher Bashar al-Assad got his grimy hands on Yarmouk, it wasn't long before journalists were calling the city the worst place on earth. Why? Several reasons. And I'll tell you those reasons along with the world's reaction to them. Then you decide what that means. On December the 16th, 2012, the Syrian Air Force bombed Yarmouk, killing at least dozens of civilians. The real number may never be known. The streets of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Toronto, London, Paris, Rome, Dublin, etc. All quiet. Tens of thousands of Palestinians fled Yarmouk and were displaced without anywhere to go and without knowing if or when they may ever return. For the Palestinians who stayed in Yarmouk, they could not possibly have imagined the dystopian hellscape that awaited them over the next 6+ years. First, Assad enforced a brutal and complete 1-year-long siege on Yarmouk. He then continued that siege, only with a few exceptions, for another 5 to 6 years after that. Were the streets of the world filled with protesters? No. There was no electricity in Yarmouk for a year, and very little electricity for the next 5 years. No protests. There was no piped water whatsoever in Yarmouk for a year, and very little drinkable water for the next 5 years. No protests. There was no access to, or very little, minimal access to any food for a year, and very little food for the next 5 years. No protests. Medical supplies were next to zero. As Assad did not want to risk them ending up in the hands of opposition fighters hiding in Yarmouk, Palestinian civilians be damned. But even worse, after the initial fleeing of tens of thousands, the remaining Palestinians of Yarmouk were not allowed to leave the city, and Assad made them stay there. So, in the largest Palestinian city, Palestinian civilians were indiscriminately slaughtered. Tens of thousands fled, and then Assad laid total siege to the remaining tens of thousands of Palestinians, during which men, women, children, the elderly, the infirm, and babies were all forced to stay in Yarmouk without electricity, without water, with minimal access to food, and with little to no access to any medication or first aid of any kind. And there were no protests. The number of Palestinians who died of malnutrition and the number of Palestinian women and their babies who died in childbirth during the siege is unknown to this day. There was no worldwide outcry. There was no push for real numbers of the dead and the suffering. There were no protests. There was near total silence. Much has been made about the humanitarian corridors and humanitarian aid that Israel has allowed to flow into Gaza despite Hamas terrorists using the corridors to escape, and despite well over 50% of that aid being stolen by Hamas. Well, in Syria, Assad refused to provide a humanitarian corridor, and he refused to allow humanitarian relief into Yarmouk. The streets of the world, silent. One Palestinian woman in Yarmouk described the scene. You couldn't buy bread. At the worst point, a kilo of rice cost 12,000 Syrian pounds. Now it is 800 pounds, compared to 100 Syrian pounds in central Damascus. It was 900 pounds for a kilo of tomatoes. We used to eat wild plants. We picked and cooked them. In every family there was hepatitis because of a lack of sugar. The water was dirty. People had fevers. Their joints and bones felt stiff. My middle daughter had brucellosis and there was no medication. Silence. Deafening silence. So many Palestinians in Yarmouk were dying from malnutrition that Yarmouk's largest mosque gave a religious decree, a fatwa, that permitted the consumption of dogs, cats, and donkeys. Shocking silence. In 2014, testing on a random sample of Palestinians in Yarmouk showed 40% had typhoid. Silence. All 28 of Yarmouk's schools were shuttered. Silence. Even after the initial total siege ended, the water supply was not restored. The city's water pipes were damaged in fighting in September 2014, leading to 4 more years during which Yarmouk's Palestinians had to drink untreated groundwater. Where were the protesters? During and after the complete siege, Assad began a campaign of particularly heavy, indiscriminate bombing of Yarmouk that saw civilians, including children on playgrounds, blown up. We can say thousands, but we will probably never know how many for sure. The world, silent. A UN official anonymously admitted about Yarmouk. Conditions are far worse than Gaza. Palestinians always had dignity, hope, resilience. Now, after 4 years of war, I see people giving up. They find it hard to accept there are no options. Even the virulently anti-Israel commentator Mehdi Hassan, who recently lost his job for being too viciously anti-Israel even for MSNBC, admitted in April of 2015. Let's be honest. How different, how vocal and passionate would our reaction be if the people besieging Yarmouk were wearing the uniforms of the IDF? By that point in time, Yarmouk was widely called the city with the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. But the streets of the world were not filled with protesters. There was barely a peep. Meanwhile, many of the long-suffering Palestinians of Yarmouk started obtaining desperately needed medical assistance from what many may consider an unlikely source: Israel. Starting in June 2016, the IDF launched Operation Good Neighbor to help civilians in Syria. At first, Syrians who could make it across the border were transported to Israeli hospitals, and later Israel opened a field hospital close to the border since so many civilians started seeking Israel's help. One Palestinian from Yarmouk feared enough for her son's life to seek help from enemy doctors in Israel. When her son was treated with care and humanity and nursed back to health, she told journalists anonymously for her own safety back home, "I used to see Israel as an occupying power, but not anymore. My whole opinion of Israel has changed." In total, Israel treated at least between 5,000 to 10,000 wounded and often starving civilians who crossed the border from Syria. Israel even started a donation drive and collected supplies like toys, crayons, games and candies for suffering children. And Israel got those donations across the border quietly, along with government-donated dire necessities like food, fuel, clothing and baby care. How many stood up to praise Israel for its humanity? Very, very few. And outside the Jewish world, almost none. The worst of the dire situation in Yarmouk went on for more than 6 years. In April of 2018, Yarmouk was being bombed twice every 90 seconds. By the end of that month, Al Jazeera estimated at least 60% of Yarmouk had been completely destroyed, and an unknown number of Palestinian families were trapped under the rubble. By May of 2018, journalists simplified it. Yarmouk is gone. See the photo below. How many pro-Palestinian protests in how many cities do you recall in April and May of 2018? How many protests do you recall for the entirety of those 6 years from 2012 to 2018? Sadly, for those innocent Palestinian civilians who lived under the yoke of dictatorship, whether Assad or Hamas, their outrageously inhumane plight was almost entirely ignored by a disinterested world. Yet how many streets of how many cities across the world were already filled with protesters during the first days and weeks after the Hamas October the 7th massacre of more than 12,000 Israelis? The streets worldwide were filled even before Israel had begun its counteroffensive to rescue the more than 240 hostages taken by Hamas and to bring Hamas terrorists to justice and forever end Hamas's ability to make war on Israel. What more evidence could anyone need? The worldwide protests are all about being anti-Israel and or anti-Semitic. They are certainly not about saving any Palestinians. Sadly, when the Palestinians have needed the world to save them from other Arabs, nobody marched. Only when Jews are involved, that's when the venom, the hate, the motivation, and the organization to protest and intimidate comes out. Now, I did actually... I added a kind of little reply of my own, right? See it somewhere. Okay. What I said in reply was a heartbreaking read. I guess a counter-argument could be Syria isn't a Western ally, so no point pressing our government to ceasefire. Or that the original sin is still the Nakba, brutally displacing the Palestinians to Syria in the first place, and more reason for the right of return. And a tweeter replied to me, There was a Jewish Nakba too. 800 to 900,000 Jews displaced from Arab countries from 1948 to 1956. 600,000 went to Israel. Most Israelis are Mideast Jews. Look it up. More Jews displaced than Palestinians. They moved on with life and made farms, tech, educated, and did not wallow in pity. Now, Operation Good Neighbor. Israel is held to a higher standard. And really that story confirms to me do the sins of Israel in its founding, the Nakba, the massacres of Tantora and Deir Yassin and dozens of other towns. Sorry, Deir Yassin. The war crimes that were committed, and they were war crimes. Do they invalidate Israel's right to exist? I did ask that in The Darkness on the Left, and I came to a pragmatic reason that, regardless of anything, Israel had to exist. It had to exist because anything else meant regional destabilization. It meant the death of its citizens against a murderous enemy that for some reason is being emboldened by the UN and by the Western left, who seem to want Netanyahu punished for war crimes when he hasn't even completed the objective of the war, which is to remove Hamas from power. And if he's punished for that, and Hamas escape justice, the next prime minister they deal with is going to be under pressure to be even more lenient with Hamas when they've already survived. It's sick, I think. But the truth is, my defense of Israel was a bit of a soulless one, I think. Because it never really went into the idea of what a state could be. Israel's founding was ruthless. The soldiers in Tantora said it. You take a state by force. It was conquered ruthlessly. But once the state was established, like in 1948, it was a young state in the Middle East, in a volatile region, against hostile forces. It's surrounded by hostile neighbors. It became Fortress Israel. It didn't really drop its guard easily. But there's many things a state can become from there. Many things a state can grow into. And Syria did more, and Operation Good Neighbor was proof that Israel could indeed become, despite its ruthless beginnings, it can still become a state. Like, it can become, a state can become many things from its founding. And Operation Good Neighbor showed that it could actually become a humanitarian state.
We are looking into Syria, site of just the worst civil war imaginable. Syrians who are wounded or in need of medical attention have been getting medical attention from the Israelis.
Sometimes they're wounded and sometimes those are sick women or children. I cannot imagine how they feel.
Yeah.
Sometimes they come and they're just so scared and you can barely get them talk. And sometimes they say toda, thank you in Hebrew. That's
for
in
a
my
Syrian
language.
to thank you in
Yeah.
Hebrew is pretty special.
Yes.
It could show, it had to be ruthless in the fight for the Middle East. This was a chance for Israel to show it could be humanitarian. It could make a bold humanitarian gesture to its neighbours and show them that we don't have to be enemies.
ישנה תפיסה שנקראת שכנות טובה, שנמשכת כבר שנים, שבו אנחנו מסייעים לבני המקום. אני חושב שזו חובה בסיסית שלנו כשכנים וכיהודים.
אנחנו צריכים להבין שבעצם אנחנו מדברים על מדינת סוריה. לאורך כל 40 שנה שהם מכירים את עצמם, הם גדלו על כל ההגדה הזאת שמעבר לגבול נמצא האויב הכי נשבע על בני אדמות, וזה מדינת ישראל. ואז במהלך 5 שנים האחרונות, כל הדוקטרינה הזאת למעשה מתהפכת על פיה, ולמעשה האנשים מתחילים להבין שהאויב הכי נשבע שהיה, הוא היחיד שבעצם מסוגל או רוצה או מוכן להגיש לך עזרה. אנחנו בתור המנהלת, אנחנו יותר נותנים מענה לרפואת השגרה. בדרך כלל מדובר בילדים עם מחלות כרוניות כאלה ואחרות. הצלחנו לטפל בלמעלה מ-500 ילדים, ועם בודדים איתם באמת אולי לא מצאנו להם פתרון. לרובם ככולם כן.
Israel did more to provide humanitarian aid in Syria than any other Arab nation. In fact, Saudi Arabia and Iran particularly, and Qatar, deliberately, if anything, tried to stoke the civil war and make it worse because of their proxy war. You know, Syria kind of became a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They made the problem worse. Israel made the effort to try and provide what help they could. And they provided more than any other state in the region did. All the other states, you know, they did nothing to take in refugees. They closed the door to the refugees. Part of the reason the migrant crisis was so severe was because the door was closed to every Arab nation. But that's not really the point. The point is, you know, and after years of hostility, years of being Fortress Israel, it showed that it could be a humanitarian nation. It could be a humanitarian superpower. By the standards of the region, that is incredible. And you can see it in the IDF soldiers. This is something they're proud to do. It's a point of pride for them to do the noble thing. Operation Good Neighbor showed that Israel had the potential to become the Sweden of the Middle East, the humanitarian superpower of the Middle East. You know, this was just the beginning, possibly. And if it hadn't been for the years of hostility and animosity that was stoked up by the Arab states, who knows how much sooner? Who knows? And that story of them nursing a Palestinian mother's child to health it'd be nice to think that it was a brief moment of Israel making amends in a way, and a brief moment of Palestinian forgiveness. It was probably only one example. It would have been nice if it could have been more than that. And it just baffles me that of all the states in the Middle East, this is the one that the left would want the region to be rid of. The only state in the region that did anything humanitarian in the Syrian conflict. It was a pride of principle. It was, an encouragement for Israel to do the right thing, do the best thing in a horrible situation. No other nations even bothered. And it was something that the soldiers were proud to do. Something that they were touched by. And so it could have become, and if that could be encouraged, then you have a far better Israel. That has a surer sense of its sense of purpose. Who knows how much more humanitarian Israel could have been if there wasn't so much stuck against it by the opposition of Arab states, who just never recognized the existence of Israel. I see a lot of people rushing to condemn Israel. I've rarely seen people rushing to praise it for good behavior, which is ideally the kind of thing you want to encourage in the Middle East, because it's in short supply there. You can say maybe Israel has not made enough amends to the Palestinians. Maybe they haven't. Who knows? But this was the start, and it could have been the start of something beautiful. But the left don't care. It could have been the start of that reconciliation and forgiveness, or at least it's a glimpse into a parallel universe in which it could have happened en masse, maybe. This is why, as far as I'm concerned, Israel has to win. It has to survive. It has to win. But the tragedy of October the 7th is, I think, this direction for Israel. This brief moment of hope for Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. Israeli amends and Palestinian forgiveness. Sadly, after October the 7th, it looks like that's a false dawn. It looks like there's no way back to 2016.
One of the things that I think many people outside Israel haven't realized is that many of the kibbutz, the places where people were living, the villages and towns neighboring Gaza, were filled with left-wing peacenik types. The sort of people, for instance, who there was a woman in one kibbutz who every day she drove Palestinian children to hospitals. There were people who made sure they always had Palestinian colleagues from Gaza. They would employ them. Even the peace rave near the borders of Gaza, was significantly populated by people who sort of had the peace gig. I mean, that was their belief. That was their view, that they wanted to live in peace with their Palestinian neighbors. I think that one thing that people outside Israel really haven't understood is that it is these people who were disproportionately murdered in their homes on October the 7th. You can see it literally on the signs they have on their fridges and their fridge doors in what remains of their houses. Peace signs, calls for peace. I think that this is so important to realize. And one other thing, many of the Hamas fighters, terrorists, who were found dead or captured alive after that day were found to have plans on them which had extraordinarily detailed issues about who lived in which house. There are stories of, there's one kibbutz where the man who was in charge of security in the kibbutz, the terrorists went to his house first and killed him and his family, and then went door to door elsewhere. How did they have all of this knowledge, literally family by family, door to door? It was because some of the people they had given their trust to had sold them out, had given information over to Hamas to get them killed. Now that is going to have in Israel a seismic effect in the years ahead. Anyone who thinks that what we heard from Jeremy Corbyn and Len McCluskey is remotely possible is living in a different century to the one we're now in.
That future is gone by Hamas. And for that, Hamas cannot be forgiven, and the left who support them can never be forgiven. And only one state can survive this. Only one state must survive this. Sadly, reconciliation seems to be something that Israel and Palestine have missed the boat on. And some of that is Israel's fault. Some of that is down to Israeli arrogance, Israeli paranoia. Some of it wasn't exactly wholly founded paranoia. But there were other factors as well. There was opposition to it, external opposition to it from the start, throughout. And over time, the Palestinians existed in limbo. And some of them became, and a worrying number of them became more and more warped. To the point where now it seems very doubtful indeed that coexistence can work. And the UN has been no help. It's been far from help. It's always been unfit for purpose. Or at least it's been unfit for purpose for a long time. Same with the Palestinian cause as a critical mass. Despite the fact that I think there are good people in there, there's still an overriding rot in the movement, and its goals are not toward any kind of peace or justice for the Palestinians or Israel. It might have started out that way, but it's not about that anymore. It's about being Iran's puppets on a string. What a shame that some countries get to stand and some countries are forced to fall. Anyway, this is Sadako24 signing out.